watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Your host, Michael. What I wanted to do in this video is address a very common argument that I hear from Eastern Orthodoxy against the papacy. So it's against Catholicism, but it tends to be something that has not been addressed very thoroughly by Catholics. So I would like to briefly engage it, though it's not going to be an in-depth treatise. I think it will prime the pump. Well, the argument that I'm referring to is one that I've named the argument from the principle of accommodation. The principle of accommodation is a term that Francis Dvornik uses in his book Byzantium and the Roman Primacy, and we will discuss what it is here in a moment, but it uses this concept, or Orthodoxy does, and it makes a claim against Catholicism based on it. Well, what is the principle of accommodation? This may not be a familiar term, but it's probably a concept you've heard of before. He says this in his book on page 29. For the church, from the very first days of its existence, had conformed itself for the organization of its ecclesiastical administration to the political divisions of the Roman Empire, which is true. It is very true. Often bishops of more important territories in the Roman Empire carried more weight than bishops that were a bishop of a territory less important in the empire. So this is very true. The important fact has too often been neglected by church historians, who are inclined to see in it rather an anomaly and a deterioration of the apostolic tradition in the church. In reality, this principle of accommodation to the political division of the empire had been introduced by the apostles themselves, and there were practical reasons why they did so. So here he defines his term principle of accommodation, which is what the entire chapter is about, as this idea that the church, even going back to the apostles, sort of structured itself around the structure of the Roman Empire. That much is true, that much is granted. But the argument is one that we'll see where Orthodox will take this principle and use it against the claims of Rome by saying, well, Rome only had its position in the empire and its privileges. It only had its position in Catholicism, or I should say in the church, because of its position in the empire, not because of anything else, but merely because that is where the capital used to be. And when the new capital in Constantinople was brought about, well, New Rome, Constantinople, now has equal privileges as Old Rome. Therefore, Old Rome can't really claim any kind of authority in the church higher than, say, the See of Constantinople, because again, its position is merely one that goes back to its location in relation to the Roman Empire. That's the only reason why it had the privileges that it had. It didn't have any kind of apostolic or divine privileges granted to it or to the See of Peter and then to his successor in the city of Rome. That's kind of the idea. And there's a hint of this at Chalcedon in Canon 28. Now, Canon 28 was rejected in the West. Pope Leo, by the authority of St. Peter, annuls the canon. So here you have a pope annulling the canon of an ecumenical council. And we can look at the canon here in just a moment, but you even see this in 381 with the Council of Constantinople I, where it similarly puts forward an idea about Constantinople and speaks about its position in the church, and it ties it into this idea of the principle of accommodation and likens it to Old Rome. We'll look at it again here in just a second, but seemingly it looks like, oh wow, well, these canons actually are backing up this idea that Rome doesn't really have a special place in the church other than something that was by happenstance, circumstantial, political. It's because of its location in the empire, not because of anything Christ said or instituted or anything the apostles taught. It should be noted that even this canon mentioned in the Council of Constantinople I was not accepted in the West, by the way. So these were canons that were contested in the West, but accepted by some in the East. Now, it's interesting that Canon 28, another one of the canons that we're referring to here at the Council of Chalcedon that was annulled by Pope Leo, it's also interesting that it had a rough reception even in the East, not just only in the West, but also in the East. It wasn't immediately accepted. Even by Constantinople. You even have the Patriarch of Constantinople immediately bowing to the authority of Pope Leo, who annuls Canon 28, and he simply acquiesces to the decision of the Pope and says that, whatever Pope Leo says goes. Here's Canon 28, though, which seemingly gives support to this idea of the principle of accommodation against the Catholic claims about the papacy. Following in all things the decisions of the Holy Fathers and acknowledging the canon which has just been read, the 150 bishops, beloved of God, who assembled in the imperial city of Constantinople, which is New Rome, in the time of the Emperor Theodosius of happy memory, we also do enact and decree the same things concerning the privileges of the Most Holy Church of Constantinople, which is the New Rome. For the Fathers rightly granted privileges to the throne of Old Rome, because it was the royal city, and the 150 most religious bishops, actuated by the same consideration, gave equal privileges to the most holy throne of New Rome, justly judging that the city, which is honored with the sovereignty of the Senate and enjoys equal privileges with the old imperial Rome, should in ecclesiastical matters also be magnified as she is, and rank next after her, so that in Pontic, the Asian and the Thracian dioceses, the metropolitans only, and such bishops also of the diocese aforesaid, are among the barbarians, should be ordained by the aforesaid most holy throne of the most holy Constantinople, every metropolitan of the aforesaid dioceses, together with the bishop of his province, ordaining his own provincial bishops, as has been declared by the divine canons, but that, as has been said above, the metropolitans of the aforesaid dioceses should be ordained by the Archbishop of Constantinople after the proper elections had been held according to the custom and have been reported to him. Wow, a mouthful. But I think you get the point here. The idea is that it's saying, well, look, the privileges that are granted to New Rome, Constantinople, are based on its relationship to the empire. It's the new capital in the empire, the eastern part of the empire. So Old Rome, the old capital of the western part of the Roman Empire, has its privileges because of its relationship to the empire, and likewise New Rome should have its privileges in the church because of its relationship to the empire. So it should be over certain territories, and it should be second in the taxis in the order of churches, even over Alexandria and Antioch, which are Petrine sees. They are sees established by St. Peter. So again, this canon had a rocky reception in the East. It was actually a little while before it was actually accepted in the East. It wasn't immediately received. Moreover, again, the West immediately rejects Canon 28 from Chalcedon, and Pope Leo, again, by the authority of St. Peter, annuls the thing and says absolutely not, for multiple reasons. And once again, this canon is similar to what we see in Constantinople I, where the bishops put forward a shorter version of this canon, but with kind of the same idea about Constantinople being New Rome, and it should be ranked second in the order of sees. Well, as I noted, Constantinople I's canon here was not accepted in the West. Arguably, it's never been received in the West even until this day, that particular canon. But we still need to address it. In order to do that, first, I want to appeal to something that Pope Damasus says 1 year after Constantinople 1 year after the canon which teaches this principle of accommodation, or the argument from the principle of accommodation, I should say. 1 year after that, this is what Pope Damasus says. And by the way, it's not certain that Pope Damasus even received that canon from Constantinople. He may or may not have been aware of it. The curious thing, though, is for him to release and decree what I'm about to read, especially if he had never heard of the canon put forward by Constantinople I. That's very odd. He says this: likewise, it is decreed after the announcement of all the prophetic and evangelic as well as apostolic writings, which we have listed above as scriptures, on which by the grace of God the Catholic Church is founded, we have considered that it ought to be announced that although all the Catholic Church is spread abroad through the world, comprise but one bridal chamber of Christ, nevertheless, the Holy Roman Church has been placed at the forefront, and here's the kicker, not by the conciliar decisions of other churches, so not because of councils and their decisions, but has received the primacy by the evangelic voice of our Lord and Savior, who says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you have bound on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." He appeals, in this case, to the words of the Lord Jesus for the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, not because of its position in the empire. He does go on to say this: in addition to this, there is also the companionship of the vessel of election, the most blessed Apostle Paul, who contended and was crowned with a glorious death along with Peter in the city of Rome in the time of Caesar Nero, not at a different time as the heretics prattle, but at once at the same time and on one and the same day, and they equally consecrated the above mentioned Holy Roman Church to Christ the Lord. And by their own presence and by their venerable triumph, they set it at the forefront over all of the other cities of the whole world. The first see, therefore, is that of Peter the Apostle, that of the Roman Church, which has neither stain nor blemish nor anything like it. There's your seed of papal infallibility. The second see, however, is that at Alexandria, interesting, consecrated in behalf of the blessed Peter by Mark, his disciple and an evangelist who was sent to Egypt by the apostle Peter, where he preached the word of truth and finished his glorious martyrdom. The third honorable see, indeed, is that at Antioch, which belonged to the most blessed apostle Peter, where he first dwelt before he came to Rome, and where the name Christians was first applied as to a new people. A lot going on here, but 2 points I want to note. Number one, he doesn't see it as a problem to say, yes, one of the reasons why Rome is so venerable is because Paul helped establish it. He doesn't have a problem saying that. That's true. Likewise, we could say, yes, one of the reasons why Old Rome is so venerable is because of its relationship to the Roman Empire. Sure, the principle of accommodation is true, and that did help bolster the claims of the Roman See. That's not, however, the only reason why it is primary in the church. But it's first and foremost because of the words of Christ to St. Peter. So you'll notice two things. He wants to say, ultimately, the primacy of Rome is because of a divine institution, because of what Christ said to St. Peter. And yes, these other things about St. Paul helped founding Rome, co-founding Rome with Peter, yes, that bolsters Rome's claims. And yes, there's a lot of martyrs there. And yes, its relationship to the empire. All that's true, but it's not merely that. It's first and foremost, first in the church because of a divine institution based on Matthew 16. And he thinks, implicitly, you could see, since it has no stain nor blemish, he thinks that that means that it is going to be indefectible, especially because it's rooted in a promise of Christ. So this idea that it might be transferred, this primacy could be transferred elsewhere, doesn't seem native to Pope Damasus. But again, he then mentions Antioch and Alexandria and mentions that they're Petrine sees too. But you'll note he says Rome is first, and he only locates Rome's position with the words of Christ. He doesn't say the same for Alexandria and Antioch, even though they're established by Peter, because he recognizes that Rome was uniquely established as the see of St. Peter. We could speak of Alexandria and Antioch being sees of Peter insofar as he established them, but that's not where he divested his authority that was given to him by Christ. That was Rome alone. And that's why the promise made to Peter in Matthew 16 is applied by Damasus only to Rome, not to Alexandria and Antioch. So those who would say, well, all three of these sees, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, are all Petrine sees, therefore none of them, Rome is not superior to any of these others. It's not uniquely different. That's not true. Though we can say all three are Petrine sees, we would say they're Petrine sees in different ways. The first is a Petrine see in the sense that not only was it founded by St. Peter, but it was also the see where he divested and discharged his unique authority given to him in Matthew 16. Whereas the other two sees, Alexandria and Antioch, are established by Peter, but not in the sense where he divests his ultimate authority, where the promises that were made to him in Matthew 16 and elsewhere by Jesus are invested into that see. So, again, 2 points to summarize from what we see in Damasus. He's okay, he's comfortable with appealing to circumstantial arguments. He doesn't mention the principle of accommodation. He doesn't explicitly do that. But you could see that he would be comfortable with it, given what he says about St. Paul co-founding Rome. But you could also see him say that, wait, but Rome is much more than that because of the promise made by Christ to St. Peter. And again, he wants to distinguish between the role of Rome as a Petrine see and the Rome of Alexandria and Antioch as Petrine sees in a different sense. So he wants to distinguish between them, and rightly so. We could appeal to many other church fathers, many other popes that reiterate the same claim. Some of these claims were actually put forward at the ecumenical councils and received the approbation of the fathers of some of these councils. And that's what's interesting, because the same councils that are putting forward this idea of the principle of accommodation, well, the same ecumenical councils with the same authority will also accept certain ideas about the Roman primacy and papacy that are incompatible with Eastern Orthodoxy today, because they go beyond the principle of accommodation and they root the claims of the Roman see in the promises that Christ made to St. Peter in Matthew 16 and elsewhere. So again, in summary, we could say that the principle of accommodation in and of itself is true, but can we use this to say that that's all that Rome is, and the reasons why it had privileges in the early church is merely because of its position in the Roman Empire? No. There is very good attestation in the first millennium to many saints, and Pope Damasus is a saint not only in Catholicism but also Orthodoxy. Many saints attested to Rome having a unique claim to the Apostle Peter, a unique role in the church, and they rooted it in a divine institution, not just the principle of accommodation. I hope this has been helpful. If it has, be sure to subscribe, hit that like button. Let me know what you think in the comment section. And, also check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology, if you want to support what I'm doing here, or just hit the join button here on the channel and you can join the channel. Either way, either platform, you'll get access to extra perks like extra videos that I do that are not available to everybody on YouTube, but only to patrons. And of course, that also goes to help me in what I do and continue to offer videos to everybody. All right, that's going to do it. We'll see y'all later. God bless.